Hi everyone, welcome to our talk Privacy Preserving and Incrementally Deployable Support for Certificate Transparency in Tor. I'm Rasmus. This work is part of my PhD studies and is joined together with Tobias Puls from Karlstad University, Tom Ritter from Mozilla, and Paul Syverson from the US Naval Research Laboratory. To get started, I would like to remind us of the past. The year is 2011, summer just arrived, and we are located in the northern parts of Netherlands. The offices of DigiNotar appear to be operating as usual. Had we been there at the time, we probably wouldn't have thought that they'd be out of business in September. What happened? Let me give you the backdrop. DigiNotar was a so-called certificate authority that issued certificates for the web. Your browser uses these certificates to verify that you're really visiting the website that you intended to and not some attacker. Sounds great. What's the catch? Well, you have to trust that no certificate authority is going to mess up the certificate issuance process. Any failure in this process may result in a misissued certificate, which in turn may result in insecure connections. Okay, so I think most of you know what happened. DigiNotar was hacked. They misissued certificates for Google, Mozilla, Tor, and many others. This was actually detected by DigiNotar. In response, they decided to be silent and cover it up. The main reason why we, the public, detected that DigiNotar was no longer operating in good faith is because of a large-scale attack in Iran. Some of the misissued certificates were used to intercept network traffic of 300,000 Gmail users. Perhaps we were actually lucky to detect the attack at all. If the attacker had been more stealthy, DigiNotar might still have been in operation today. That is a scary thought. Can we do better? Fortunately, the answer is yes. Just to make sure that we are on the same page. A large-scale attack should not be necessary to detect if a trusted party like DigiNotar misbehaves. And it is not like we are only talking about a single isolated incident. The real problem is that we have hundreds of certificate authorities that claim to issue certificates only to the rightful domain owners. Every now and then, someone gets it wrong. What we are left with is an incident that endangers our digital safety, sometimes even our physical safety, depending on the real-world context. What certificate transparency brings to the table is the ability to detect misissued certificates. The basic idea is that every issued certificate must be disclosed in a public log that anyone can inspect. Usually, certificate authorities are the ones doing the logging. Websites then serve the issued certificate together with some proofs of logging. The browser verifies these proofs before accepting the certificate as valid. This is actually great, because now a website can look for certificates that match their domain name in the log. If something shows up that they did not ask for, well, now they are aware of that. They probably wouldn't have been without the log. In response, you might question the certificate authority, initiate a revocation process, and so forth. Certificate transparency, or CT for short, has been and is still being gradually rolled out by Google and others. For example, every certificate must be CT compliant to validate in Google Chrome and Apple Safari. CT compliance basically means that at least 2 logs must have quote-unquote promised to make that certificate available to the public. Such a promise is usually called an SCT, and it is hard-coded into the issued certificate. Browsers currently use these SCTs as proofs of logging. It is possible to verify that these promises are in fact true. That is an important part to ensure that blind trust is not shifted from certificate authorities to CT logs. However, such verification is challenging because of the added complexity and possible privacy concerns. For example, to verify that the certificate is in fact included in a log, you need to interact with the log ecosystem. Such interactions leak a user's browsing patterns to the logs, and that is kind of problematic. The problem that we're trying to take on in this paper is adding support for CT in Tor browser. In other words, right now CT is not enforced at all, and that is something we would like to change. The reason why we would like to change that is, first of all, we don't want users of Tor browser to be subject to DigiNotar-style attacks. This is in fact easier against Tor browser because you can position yourself in the network by volunteering to run Tor relays. This type of attacker has been observed several times in Tor, for example using self-signed certificates or simply targeting HTTP traffic. Now that encryption on the web matured and continues to mature, you kind of need a misissued certificate to pull off these attacks. So this is probably a good enough argument already to add CT in Tor browser. The second threat that is very important for Tor is that an attacker may rely on interception to de-anonymize a subset of users. For context, recall that Tor is a low-latency anonymity network that routes your traffic through a guard relay, a middle relay, and an exit relay. At each hop, a layer of encryption is peeled off, such that the guard only learns the sender's identity and the exit only learns the visited website. If the attacker can intercept the encrypted traffic at the exit using a misissued certificate, it would be trivial to de-anonymize a user that logs into a service. We have also observed cases in the past where attackers break Tor's anonymity by serving zero-day exploits to the browser. A prerequisite to serve such an exploit is the ability to make it load. Again, because the web is mostly encrypted these days, a misissued certificate can help to make that loading procedure happen. So, in terms of threat modeling, we assume a powerful attacker that has access to a browser zero-day exploit. The attacker also has the usual Tor capabilities, like controlling and denying service to a fraction of relays. In addition to that, the attacker has access to a certificate authority that can misissue certificates on request. Our design further permits the attacker to control enough CT logs so that you can trivially bypass today's definition of CT compliance. This is actually one of the reasons why we started looking into Tor in the first place. If a major problem with full decentralized verification is privacy, then we might have better luck in Tor's more private setting. What we are proposing is a gradual rollout plan. The first step is to catch up with today's CT-compliant browsers. Pairs of logs are trusted blindly because there is no follow-up verification of the log's SETs. Recall from earlier that SETs are promises of public logging. In an ideal world, these promises are also verified by someone. Is this first step suboptimal? Yes. Is it a significant improvement when compared to what we had before? Also yes. How to do this is not really a research problem, to be honest. It is, however, a reasonable starting point that we know doesn't break the web. The reason why we know that is because other browsers already do it. I like to think of this first increment as ruling out many weaker attackers that may control certificate authorities but not enough CT logs. Next, we propose some incremental steps to get started with the decentralized verification that will reduce trust in the log ecosystem. I will get back to this later, because it is more intuitive to introduce the full design that places no blind trust in the log ecosystem. In terms of trust assumptions, we go from pairs of logs that are trusted blindly, to some log that is trusted blindly, to no log that is trusted blindly. Okay, what I'm hoping to do for the remainder of this presentation is to give you an intuition of A, how we arrived at the full design that is now in front of us, and B, what complexities can we get rid of to roll it out gradually. To help us think and reason about the design, we divided it into phases. Phase 1 takes place before Phase 2, Phase 2 takes place before Phase 3, and so forth. For security, it should be difficult for the attacker to reliably interfere without detection in any phase. Misbehavior of certificate authorities and/or CT logs are detected after the final phase played out. Examples of misbehavior include creating a misissued certificate or not making it available to the public after promising to do so. Let's look at each phase separately. The first phase happens in Tor browser. A so-called SFO, which is really just a certificate chain and its associated SETs, is presented to Tor browser during a website visit. If this SFO is CT compliant, we accept the connection to avoid any blocking and degraded user experience. Now, we want to do better than just trusting the log's promises of public logging. This means that we will need to audit encountered SFOs by interacting with the logs. The simplest thing that comes to mind is to fetch an inclusion proof from a log. This interaction is privacy invasive with a regular browser, but less so with Tor browser because of its anonymity properties. An immediate problem, however, is that Tor browser has a disk avoidance criteria. This means that no browsing-related activity can be persisted after closing Tor browser. This includes encountered SFOs that have yet to be audited. In practice, it takes up to 24 hours before a certificate is logged. This follows from a so-called maximum merge delay. In other words, we will have to wait at least 24 hours before a newly issued certificate can be audited. Tor browser has likely been shut down by then, which means that the SFO will be deleted and thus not audited. A second problem is that the attacker controls the log, and in our threat model, the attacker also has a zero day against the browser. The attacker could trivially delay the log's response while taking control of the browser to disable the auditing mechanism altogether. So, what we need is to get the encountered SFO away from Tor browser as soon as possible so that someone can audit it. A strawman design would be to send all SFOs to a centralized third party that is trusted. However, that party would get a considerable aggregation of browsing patterns. Such population data is valuable and better not collected. Another problem is that a centralized solution does not scale with the network. What we do instead is to utilize Tor's existing relays to help with CT auditing. Such certificate transparency relays are called CTRs in our design. Relays may be assigned the CTR flag similar to how a Tor relay may be assigned the HSDR flag if some conditions are met. To reduce overhead, only a sample of SFOs are submitted to randomly selected CTRs. The probability of detection can therefore not be larger than the probability that an encountered SFO is submitted for auditing. Note that it is important that the attacker cannot infer which CTR received an SFO, because Tor's threat model includes DOS attacks on individual CTRs. If you can take the right CTR offline, then the submitted SFO would not be audited and any misbehavior would thus not be detected. We discuss how the attacker can try to infer this in the paper using their 0-day exploit. It boils down to winning a race against us, submitting the SFO on a one-time Tor circuit that was prepared ahead of time. Okay, the CTR received a submitted SFO. Now what? The simplest thing would be to challenge the log to prove inclusion if the SFO's maximum merge delay elapsed, and otherwise wait until it does. The problem with contacting the log immediately is that it leaks a lot of valuable information to the attacker. For example, it is deterministic when the CTR will do its auditing. That helps with interference planning. It also leaks real-time browsing patterns, which are helpful for traffic analysis against Tor. Since we will anyway need to buffer newly issued SFOs until the maximum merge delay elapsed, it is not an added complexity to always buffer SFOs for a random amount of time to reduce this leakage. Leakage to CT logs are also reduced because CTRs cache audited SFOs. To summarize the basics of the buffer phase then, you receive an SFO. If you have not seen it before, you buffer the SFO until the log's maximum merge delay elapsed. You also add a random auditing delay to obfuscate real-time browsing patterns. Phase 3 starts when it is time to do the auditing. The attacker's best bet to interfere in Phase 2 is to do a so-called network-wide flush. Please refer to our paper for more details. The TLDR is that we cannot prevent such interference, but it is trivially detected and draws unwanted attention if CTRs publish relevant metrics. After an SFO's buffering phase is over, the CTR will challenge a log to prove inclusion. This inclusion proof will reference the first signed treehead in Tor's consensus that should have merged it by now. If you are familiar with gossip, notice that the difficulty of presenting an undetected split view here is as difficult as breaking Tor's consensus mechanism. Other user agents than Tor browser can benefit from this. Anyhow, an important detail that we discuss in the paper is that the attacker, who controls the log, can likely infer which CTR queried for inclusion. Surprisingly, perhaps, it may even be so despite using Tor. It is problematic if the attacker can infer the CTR's identity. Then you basically do a DOS on that relay, and the misissued SFO goes unnoticed. To err on the safe side, we decided to assume that the attacker can in fact identify which CTR queried for inclusion. In other words, once a misissued SFO has been queried for, the querying CTR becomes unavailable. To prepare against this threat, each CTR collaborates with another CTR. That other CTR is called the watchdog in our design. Before doing an inclusion query, the CTR sends the SFO upfront to watchdog. If the query succeeded, the watchdog receives an acknowledgement. If there is no timely acknowledgement, it is the watchdog's responsibility to report that SFO to a trusted auditor that will investigate the issue further. The reason why it is not the watchdog that does the final investigation is because the average Tor relay operator cannot be expected to do so. Tor relays are also designed not to write data to disk unless debugging is enabled. Such disk writes would increase the risk of unwanted search, seizure, and forensic analysis of the operator's physical servers. Now you might feel like you got a runaround. We started by saying that we cannot have a centralized third-party auditor. Yet, in the end, it is a centralized third-party auditor that investigates potential issues. What's different here is that the number of SFOs that reach these auditors are reduced in numbers. Under normal circumstances, an auditor should not receive any report at all. If some log suffers from bad availability, the number of reports are also limited in our design because CTRs back off immediately after a failed query. What we trust these auditors with is a tiny subset of SFOs that need further investigation. These auditors also don't have to scale with the network because the expected number of reports is very small. Let's put it all together. For each certificate validation in Tor browser, we basically flip a coin if it should be submitted to random CTR for auditing. We made this as difficult as possible for the attacker to identify this CTR. CTRs buffer incoming SFOs until they can be audited. To reduce leakage to the logs, random delays are added and audited SFOs are cached. SFOs are audited against signed tree heads in Tor's consensus. This makes it as difficult to fork the log as it is to forge a valid Tor consensus. Other ecosystems can benefit from this and not just Tor. While an SFO is audited, we erred on the safe side and assumed that the attacker can infer from the inclusion query which CTR holds evidence of certificate authority and/or log misbehavior. This means that the holding CTR can be knocked offline shortly thereafter. To guard against this threat, a watchdog receives the SFO upfront. If there is no timely acknowledgement, a report is sent to a trusted auditor that investigates the issue further. Such reporting should be rare. Even if a log becomes unavailable, our design ensures that a limited amount of SFOs leak to these auditors. Although these auditors don't have to scale with the network anymore, it requires both new software and operations to be deployed. The overall complexity in phase 2, 3, and 4 is also quite a leap from just basic CT compliance. Therefore, we proposed a simplified version that can be deployed incrementally. Phase 1 is identical in our incremental designs. The main difference is that no inclusion proofs will be fetched. Instead, CTRs are going to cross-log certificates and possibly entire SFOs if CT logs allow it. You can think of this as using the log ecosystem against the attacker. CT logs are basically repurposed as CT auditors. A cross-log certificate becomes public so that certificate authority misbehavior can be detected by anyone that inspects the logs. Of course, this assumes that at least some log is honest. We can also detect log misbehavior if CT logs allowed logging of SCTs, not just certificates. That, however, requires an extended CT log API. Personally, I think that would be a valuable addition to the log ecosystem, because it provides a well-defined place to do casual SFO reporting. As a takeaway, I hope that you are convinced that Tor browser would benefit from CT. This was the first part of the presentation. CT would also benefit from more auditing, which we can do here in a secure and privacy-preserving manner because of and how we use Tor. This was the second part of the presentation. An important insight from our work is that pushing the auditing logic away from Tor browser is important to defend against relevant threats. The simple approach of quote-unquote just fetching an inclusion proof does not work that well. That's it. Thanks for listening.